Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Will, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the RSA for sponsoring this talk today. I brought some groceries. I don't think I have quite enough to share here, but I went to Tesco, and I'm always fascinated by supermarkets, yours in particular, and I want to talk a little bit about the dilemma we face in the supermarket today, because I think it's tied to problems of agriculture, tied to problems of health, and certainly tied to problems of the environment. So I'm mostly concentrated on yogurt, which I think is a very interesting case of where our confusion begins. This is Benecol. We don't have this. It's very hard to tell from the name and everything about it whether this is a drug or a food. It's proven to reduce cholesterol, which sounds really good, although, of course, we haven't quite proven that cholesterol is a cause of heart disease, but we all think less of it is better. And it does this with plant stenol esters. So I'm going to just put this out here. And then we have the kids' version of yogurt, Frubes. We call this Go-Gurt. This is a very kind of processed yogurt product in a tube. It sort of looks like toothpaste, at least, yeah, here too. And quite a wonder how you get this into your body. And then I've got low-fat toffee yogurt, Tesco's own brand. And one of the interesting things about all three of these yogurts, which are all sold in one way or another as a health food, as something that's going to improve your health because they have probiotics and sometimes prebiotics, and soon we'll have postbiotics for the dead. But in fact, they all have more sugar in them per unit, per 100 grams, than Coca-Cola. More, twice as much in the case of the Tesco low-fat yogurt. So you can sort of see why a consumer would be confused around this question of health. And in fact, as we've removed fat from products, we've amped up the sugar. And many people are under the assumption that if you don't eat fat, you can't get fat. But of course, sugars can do a very good job of that. And I just, for contrast, I brought an apple and a mango. And whoever asked the first question can have their pick. I want to talk about the roots of this confusion, because I think that a lot of our problem around food traces to the ideology we bring when we walk through a supermarket or navigate a restaurant menu. And the word I use, the label I use for that ideology, and of course ideology is just a fancy word for the unspoken assumptions that organize your experience of something, is nutritionism. It is an ism, it's not a science, although it's purportedly based on the science of nutrition. And let me just lay out what I see as the four main tenets of nutritionism and see if they don't reflect your culture's understanding of food today, or perhaps your own. These tenets don't seem very controversial, but I want to argue that they should be if they're not. The first is that the important thing about any food are the nutrients it contains. And that foods are basically delivery systems for this more important category called the nutrient, which is much more scientific, much more precise. And that you should stare past the foods. You should stare past the yogurt to the sugar and to the lactose and whatever else is in there. And that's really what matters, and that's what affects your health. Now, that seems kind of uncontroversial. Nutrients are the scientific understanding of foods. But as soon as you accept that premise, you find yourself on the train. And the train is taking you to the next stop. And the next stop is that since nutrients are invisible, who among us, except a scientist, has ever actually seen a nutrient? You therefore need experts to tell you how to eat. So as soon as you accept the nutrient view of science, you accept the expert-driven food culture, if you can call it a culture at all. And I think that is a big step to take. And we have, certainly in the United States, and to judge by these products to a large extent here as well, accepted the idea that there are people with great wisdom about food and probiotics and prebiotics that can tell us precisely how to eat. It's sort of like a religion. In the same way, if what matters about religion or God is imperceptible to us and we can't have direct communication with the Godhead, we need a priesthood to navigate that relationship for us. And we certainly have a priesthood now navigating our relationship to food. Third premise, and this is true, I think, of many isms, many ideologies. It divides the world into good and evil. So at any given moment, there is some satanic nutrient we are trying to drive from the food supply. Right now, what would a satanic nutrient be? Fat, yes. Saturated fat in particular. It used to be all fat, but now we've got good fats, so that's complicated things a little bit. Trans fats, certainly, and sugar, right? Glucose. That's an evil nutrient right now. And then every one of these evil nutrients has its good doppelganger, the blessed nutrient, that if you could just get enough of it in your system, you would be healthy and possibly live forever. Probiotics now are among the blessed nutrients. What else? Omega-3 fatty acids are a blessed nutrient. They're showing up, I don't know about here, but in America, this fish fat has shown up in milk and yogurt and orange juice. It's amazing what they can do. So you've got, and then you've got, of course, the omega-6 fatty acid, which I predict is the next evil nutrient. There will be products boasting about their relative lack of omega-6. Not that we don't need omega-6, it's another essential fatty acid, but it fights with omega-3s and pushes it out of the cell membranes. Cell by cell, there's a cold war going on between those two fats, and we're getting way too much omega-6, according to the latest wisdom. So good eating becomes a matter of navigating the Scylla and Charybdis here and staying, that's not quite the right metaphor, is it? But staying away from the evil nutrients and gravitating toward the good nutrients. The fourth and last premise of nutritionism I want to draw your attention to is that the whole point of eating is about health. That when we eat, this activity takes place on a spectrum that ranges from destroying your health on one end to redeeming your health on the other. And that's what matters. Now, that seems kind of uncontroversial, but in fact, in the history of humankind, it's a rather odd idea. People have eaten for a great many other equally legitimate reasons. Let's see if we can remember a few of them. Pleasure, remember that? Community, what happens at the table when people break bread together, whether it's family, friends, even enemies. Amazing things happen when people eat together, and that's always been a very important reason to eat. And identity. Many people construct an identity or part of their identity out of what they do eat and especially what they don't eat. And that too is another equally legitimate use that humans have made of food. And we are in danger of reducing our understanding of food to this very narrow, reductionist set of nutritionism beliefs. Now, I think we would put up with this if it worked, if thinking about food as a collection of nutrients actually made us healthier, but the evidence is not very encouraging. The first great experiment with nutritionism, I would argue, is the low-fat campaign that begins in the late 70s. The low-fat campaign is to nutritionism as the Soviet Union or communist China was to Marxism. Its greatest test and most abject failure. I know, that language is rather grandiose. Let me see if I can support it. But we tried to demonize one nutrient. And in America, it begins around 1977, 1980. And we really tried to re-engineer our food supply because we had come to the understanding, and this was the scientific consensus, especially in America, but to some extent here, although there were important dissenters in England, actually, that fat, and animal fat especially, was the problem with heart disease. And that, indeed, it was the problem with obesity. And so that if you could get fat out of the diet, you would improve health. Now, something very interesting happens during this low-fat campaign, which did result in the re-engineering of our food supply. A great many low-fat and reduced-fat products In America, we got very fat on the low-fat campaign. The low-fat campaign is generally dated to 1980, and since 1980, the average American woman, adjusted for age, has put on 19 pounds, and the average American man has put on 17 pounds, partly through eating low-fat food. Because if you look at the consumption figures, what happened over that period is that people started consuming a lot more sugar. I don't remember the figures, but it's about 30% of the additional calories. Now we're also, and as that suggests, consuming between 300 and 500 more calories per person per day since 1980 in America. And I don't know what the comparable figures are here, I'm sorry, but that's a very interesting thing to happen during a low-fat campaign. Now there are two ways to explain this, the fact that we got fat when we started demonizing fat. One is, scientifically, maybe it was wrong, and fat wasn't quite the culprit we thought. And there is mounting evidence to suggest that that's true, and that we unfairly demonized fat, or all fats, and in fact, some fats are not only essential, but help make you feel full. And when you move to a low-fat product, as those yogurts do, you tend to make up for the dramatic loss of flavor that occurs when you remove fat by replacing it with sugar or salt. And indeed, we did that. So that's one problem. The other problem is, though, whenever you demonize, this is more of a psychological problem, and we can talk more about the science later of fat and carbohydrates, but when you demonize one nutrient, you tend to give a free pass to its doppelganger nutrient. So by demonizing fat, we essentially gave a free pass to sugar and refined carbohydrates of all kinds. And in America, we had Nabisco came out with this very successful brand of, let me not be too charitable and call it junk food, but it was called Snackwells. And this was cookies, crisps, all sorts of snacks that had no fat at all, real miracles of food science. They put their best minds to it and figured out how to get all the fat out of a cookie, all the fat out of a crisp. And they were incredibly popular for a few years. There were entire aisles dedicated to Snackwells in the grocery store. And the psychology around Snackwells was that since it had no fat in it, you could eat as much of them as you liked. And if one was so good for you, a whole box must be better. And indeed, there is a lot of evidence that during this low-fat campaign, we've binged on the good nutrients. So what happens is, you see, as soon as you break things into this good and evil nutrient, you've figured out a very clever way to sell more food to people and actually get them to eat more calories. So nutritionism, thinking about food this way, has not worked very well. Now, the science is part of the problem. One of the things I've been doing for the last 2 years is really studying nutritional science, because I was asked by an editor to find out, what do we really know about the links between diet and health? Really important question for all of us, I think. And my conclusion, after 2 years of looking at this question, was a lot less than most people realize, which, by the way, many nutritionists will confirm. They don't talk about it as much. They don't publish papers on their ignorance. Nobody does. They publish papers on what they found out. But our understanding of nutrition is still pretty primitive. We've only been at it about 200 years. And we are constantly being surprised to find another layer of complexity. We started out thinking nutrition was a matter of fats, carbohydrates, and protein. And those are the macronutrients, and Justus Liebig figured this out in the 1840s, and he made a baby formula with the big nutrients in it, thinking he simulated what babies needed to live. They died. He was missing something. What was it? It took about 100 years to figure it out, or 75 years, and they realized, oh, the vitamins, there's this other kind of molecule you also need. And they put vitamins in the baby formula. And lo and behold, the baby still didn't thrive. They didn't die, but they didn't thrive. They didn't do very well. They had lower IQs. They had all sorts of problems. Then they realized, oh, it's not just fat. You've got to have the right kinds of fats. And then they put the omega-3s in. And the baby formula got better. But perfection has been elusive. We still can't simulate mother's milk with great success. And I think that stands as a good metaphor for the whole field. It's very hard work. It's not like testing drugs when you're testing foods to figure out why do vegetables, heavy intake of vegetables, appear in the epidemiology to help to be protective against cancer. Every time we've thought we found the important nutrient, like beta-carotene, and we've taken it out of the carrots and put it in a supplement and given it to people, lo and behold, it doesn't do anything. And in certain populations, finished drinkers and smokers, it gives them more lung cancer. We really don't understand what is going on deep in the soul of a carrot. And I don't mean to be mystical about that, but I do mean to be humble about it. And on the other end, we don't really know very much about what's going on in the human digestive system, which, peculiarly enough, did you know that your gut has as many brain cells, neurons, as your spinal column? What are they thinking? Why do you need brain cells in your stomach? So there's a lot of mystery on both ends of the spectrum, and it's very hard to figure out. It's very hard to do a double-blind study on diet, because there is no placebo broccoli. You either know if you're eating it or you don't. And if you take it out of the diet to see what effect it does, you don't know if the perceived effect is a result of the subtraction or the addition of whatever you put in its place. So it's not like studying drugs. It's really, really hard, and we need to be humble about it. And to think we should be able to synthesize what we need in food and give everybody supplements that solves all their dietary problems, perhaps someday, I don't foreclose the possibility, but it's a long way off. So where does that leave us? How do we decide how to eat in the absence of certainty in a world where nutrition science, and I hope I don't offend any nutritionists in the audience, is approximately where surgery was in the year 1650, which is to say very promising, very interesting to watch, but not yet perhaps ready to put you on the table or completely guide your eating life. And that's the question I confronted and have been trying to answer since. Nutritionism arose to solve a very real problem, and that is the fact that we have very high rates of chronic disease linked to diet. The Western diet, as some British scientists began calling it, doctors, about 110 years ago, we have known since then populations who eat a Western diet, generally defined as lots of processed food, lots of refined fats and refined grains, very few fresh fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and lots of meat. People who eat that diet, populations who eat that diet, get very high rates of obesity, of cancer, of heart disease, of stroke, and type 2 diabetes. This has been recognized for a long time. Albert Schweitzer recognized it, Robert McCarrison, Neil Burkitt, this whole generation of British medical workers working in the colonies, watching the Western diet arrive and seeing what happened when it did, made the connection. And they said the Western diseases are probably caused by the Western diet. What they argued about, and what we're still arguing about, is what about the Western diet is the problem? Is it the fat? Is it the lack of fiber? Is it the sugar, the refined carbohydrates? Each of those men took a different position on that question, and that's still what we're arguing about. And most of the nutritional science going on is an attempt to isolate the one variable in the Western diet so that we might fix that one variable and go on our merry way. And wouldn't that be nice? But they still haven't nailed it down. And it's going to take a while for the reasons I'm describing because of the complexity of it. So that's one key fact. And in a way, that's the only fact you need to know to construct a healthy diet. No, actually two. The second fact you need to know to construct a healthy diet is something else the same people observed, which is that people eating a huge range of traditional diets all around the world managed to stay healthy on it, as long as they could get enough of it. And these diets have very little in common. So you have Inuit in Greenland subsisting by and large on seal blubber, about as high a fat diet as you could have. No heart disease, no type 2 diabetes. And then you have Maasai warriors, some of the healthiest people on earth in Africa, subsisting on a very high protein diet of cattle blood and meat. And then you have Native Americans in Central America who subsist by and large on carbohydrates, lots of carbohydrates and some protein, beans and maize. Very different diets, equally good results. The one diet that reliably seems to make populations sick is this Western diet. What an achievement for a civilization. to build from, on all these possibilities, the one diet that reliably makes its population ill. So, how do you build a diet on those two facts? Well, it was, I think, Burkett or McCarrison who said, well, you've got to go back a little bit. You've got to go back. Not all the way to the bush, although doing that would make you a lot healthier, and there have been studies showing that. But to some of the traditional dietary wisdom, the cultural wisdom around food that we have basically tossed overboard. And, you know, I realized at a certain point that science is one way of understanding the natural world, one way of understanding biology, but it's not the only one we have ever had. And long before science helped us navigate our relationship to food and so many other matters of biology, we had something called culture. And we have had that tool for many, many years, going back to that first, you know, mythical state of nature where a group of proto-humans were, as omnivores, were trying a little bit of everything, trying to figure out what worked. And one of them picked up a mushroom and ate it and keeled over and died. His or her fellows would have said to themselves, we've got to remember this. How can we remember that you don't eat that mushroom? And somebody said, I've got a really good idea. Let's give it a name. Let's use this tool called language, and let's give it a name that's very memorable. So they thought for a while, and somebody said, well, let's call it the death cap. You wouldn't eat anything with the word death in it. And that worked pretty well. So that's a very kind of high-profile example of culture helping us to navigate that. But we have so many others. And what I've been trying to do for this the project that led to this book was seeing how much of that culture was still around and how might it serve us. How might it help us get off the Western diet to whatever extent is possible and build on the wisdom of traditional diets? In some sense, it's a reactionary project. But so far, the modernist project in food has been an unalloyed disaster. So we have to go with what works. So I made I came up with, and when I say came up with, I mean I collected. I wrote some of these rules, but also collected many of the others. And they are, I put out requests on the internet. The New York Times, where I write, allowed me to do a solicitation of their readers, and I got 2,500 different suggestions, some of them absolutely crazy and useless, like you should only have one meat per pizza. I mean, aesthetically, I sort of see the point, but biologically, I'm not sure I do. Or don't eat anything bigger than your head. You know, melon, I think melon is okay. You can eat melons bigger than your head. So I tried to kind of, you know, vet these for quality. And, but a lot of them were really smart and really helpful, I think. And I think that as a way to help people tune out the conversation about nutrients and focus again on foods. I'm not saying scientists don't need to deal with nutrients. These are their tools, these reductive tools, figuring out how these very complex systems work one variable at a time. That is the scientific method. But for us, at the eating end of the food chain, until they've made a lot more progress, we can safely tune this out and rely on some other forms of wisdom. So what are these forms of wisdom? I'm just going to give a couple quick examples. They're really obvious. Don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. What would she say if you gave her a tube of that frube? Would she know what to do with it or how to get it into her body? And when she looked at the label and saw those 13 or 15 ingredients, now she's pretty smart. She knows that yogurt is basically milk in a bacterial culture. So what are those 11 other things? What's the guar gum doing there? What's the BHT and the various colorings and all this kind of stuff, flavorings? So that suggested another rule. Don't eat foods with more than 5 ingredients. Processed foods. Recipes are fine, but processed foods with more than 5 ingredients. Shop the periphery of the supermarket and stay out of the middle to the extent you can. I think this is true in England. It's certainly true all over America, but that the least processed food is usually on the perimeter because they need to restock it the most. It goes bad. And that suggests another rule. Avoid foods that never rot. Food is alive, and it should eventually die. And that, with the exception of honey, which has survived from the pyramids, most foods have been perishable to one degree or another. And there's a lot of stuff in the supermarket today, and believe me, I bought some of it. I had a pair of Twinkies. I haven't seen Twinkies here, but it's a processed angel food cake, like a log, filled with cream and covered with sugar, and they're so sweet your teeth scream in pain when you bite into one, and they're very popular. And I bought one, and I was using it as a prop, and I carried it around for 2 years. And it never got hard. It was incredible. This thing was as spongy as the day I bought it. And the only reason it expired is everybody would come up after speeches and squeeze it, and finally it collapsed. Now, what does it mean to say something doesn't rot? Well, it means something very precise. It means that the other creatures with whom we share our planet, the bacteria, the fungus, the insects, the mice, have no interest in it. And they know something about nutrition that we don't. There's not a lot of good nutrition in this. And of course, we found this with white flour. One of the reasons we refined flour was to make it less likely to go bad. And we succeeded, but in the process, we took out a lot of nutritional value. But the focus of the book is only partly on how to choose foods and avoid foods. It's also about how we eat because, and I'll just leave you on this note because I really want to hear your questions. How we eat, it turns out, may matter as much as what we eat. So that when we're eating alone, when we're eating in the car, it is not the same experience as eating with other people, as eating at tables. Portion control is enormously difficult for people, especially when you have a food industry that has figured out how to supersize portions as a way to get us to eat more. We have a lot of temptations, and food culture is one way to govern those temptations. When you eat alone, you tend to eat thoughtlessly and eat too much. Certainly when you're doing it distracted in front of the television or while driving. So one of my suggestions is eat all your meals at a table. Now that it's necessary to say such a thing in 2010 is kind of remarkable, but many of us don't eat at tables anymore. Eat when you're hungry, not when you're bored. That's kind of a radical idea, and that was submitted by several people. And I think it's true. We use food for a whole range of emotional fulfillments that have nothing to do with hunger, and we're really kind of out of touch with when we're hungry. And also, and here's kind of the most radical idea, and I'll leave you with this one, and this popped up in many, many different cultures. Stop eating before you're full. To an American, that's really radical. We're taught to eat until we're stuffed, and the food is advertised on that basis. But if you look around the world, you find rules. The Japanese have a rule, harahachi-bu, eat until you're 4/5 full. And the Prophet Muhammad even spoke on this question, and he said basically a full belly was one that was 1/3 food, 1/3 liquid, 1/3 air, nothing. So he's at the 2/3 range. The Chinese say eat until you're 75% full. The French have, this concept is encoded in their language. When they're hungry, they say, j'ai faim, I have hunger. When they're done, they don't say, I am full. They say, je n'ai plus faim, I no longer have hunger. And that's if you think about it, the moment at which you no longer have hunger is a great many bites short of the moment where you're stuffed. And that's a very we're talking about cultural practice. And my general point that I want to leave you with is that it may well be, so far, until science gets much better at what they're doing around food, that culture is the key to eating well. Preserving our food cultures, which is a matter of not only the dishes and the combinations of foods, but the rules with which we surround eating, in the face of a very concerted effort on the part of the food industry to undermine that culture, and in fact destroy it, in favor of getting you to eat 24/7 as much as possible. So on that note, I'm going to leave you and leave time so we can, Will and I can talk and take your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I quite like Rule 20, which you're talking about, which is it's not food if it arrived through the window of your car. And actually one I've been trying to teach my son, which I can't find now, which is about don't eat breakfast cereals that change the color of
the milk. Yes, yeah. Those tend to be the nastiest.
Which is a bit tricky with my son.
But the idea was to make them sticky. I mean, I'm using my whatever skills I have as a writer and editor to come up with phrases that will just, not that anyone's going to remember 64 of these rules, that's how many there are, but that 5 of them just kind of stick in your mind and give you, and they're not really rules, they're policies. Right. And you know, a personal policy is a very powerful thing. It relieves you of having to make millions of decisions every day.
But on that sort of issue about going back to culture and finding out what culture is, I suppose the problem that sticks with me is actually if you look at America as a whole, longevity is increasing. Mm-hmm. Mortality from things like heart disease is actually declining. Is there a problem, or is this really kind of attacking, you know, is this about middle-class food values versus the rest of America?
Well, it is true that longevity is increasing, and it probably is too, but if you break down those numbers, you find that I think it's gone up 17 years since 100 years ago. Very, very impressive. 10 of those years are at the beginning of life, basically sanitation and vaccination, our ability to get children through childhood. That's where the great gain is. There were plenty of people living to be in their 80s or 90s in the last century if they could survive those first couple years. The 7 years at the other end is by and large a result of medical intervention. And yes, we have come up with ingenious technologies to treat the people we have sickened. And I guess we should applaud that. And that is the choice we have now, which is to continue to medicalize the chronic disease problem the food system is creating and work on diabetes medicines and better diabetes technologies. And we're investing a lot of money in that. And we could go down that path. We could go down a path where every street corner in the inner city next to the payday loan store has a dialysis clinic. But it will bankrupt us. It's very expensive. The way we're treating heart disease, great example. We are prolonging the life, and mortality is down, but the underlying incidence of heart disease may not be down at all. There's some dispute about it. But what we've gotten good at is keeping people alive once they have these diseases. So the question you have to answer is that the way you want to deal with it? Now, capitalism loves to deal with problems by creating new industries to solve those problems. And there is a very strong economic imperative to go down that path. My argument is that it would be a whole lot more economical and beautiful to focus on changing the diet rather than hooking us all up to more and more effective machines.
I want to go straight to the thorny one of GMOs, because that's obviously, I mean, like, we've got 6 billion people to feed on this planet. And you know, it's all good to say, you know, Maasai warriors, have this diet that's very healthy. But how can that diet sustain those kind of populations unless you adopt an industrial approach to feeding the world's population?
Well, GMOs and an industrial approach are not exactly the same thing. And we shouldn't let the interest in GMOs take up all the space in the decision about industrial approach or organic approach, because I think that's a mistake. GM is one tool. It has not yet proven itself to be very powerful. And the assumption built into your question that GM can improve yields of the world's crops has not been borne out yet. Maybe it will, but everybody just takes this as an article of faith. Of course, more technology must mean more yield. They have not done that yet. There was a recent study put out by the Union of Concerned Scientists in America that found that, on balance, GM in soy had reduced yields. It offered farmers other things, but not yield, and that in corn, under very certain circumstances, and those are really the only 2 important crops so far, under very narrow set of circumstances, certain years, it increased yield when there were big outbreaks of one of the corn borers. What GM has done so far is not very helpful to the world's poor, to anyone, which is to say it has allowed farmers to expand the size of their holdings, and that one farmer can farm more land using GM than not. But expanding monocultures is not contributing to our health or our happiness, and it's contributing to more processed food and more meat consumption. Most of that grain that's being grown with GM is feeding animals. In terms of having enough food to feed the world, in 2008, which was a year of supposed food crisis, we grew enough food to feed 11 billion people. Most of it was not eaten by humans as food, however. A great deal of it was fed to animals, about half, to feed our meat habit. And a great deal, especially in the United States, was fed to automobiles. And because we're driving our cars on food right now. About 10% of the gasoline in America is used to feed cars. So it is not a question of the yield of the arable land we have so much as to what use we're putting all this food we're growing. And that, you know, people say organic can't feed the world. I'm not here to tell you, yes, it can. I know it can. But if you look at the research, you shouldn't take that as a premise of a discussion. That's an assertion. And in fact, there was a recent review of the literature that found that in industrial areas, organic achieves 92% of the yield of industrial. Okay, 8% loss in yield. But you go to the developing world, and it produces 182% of current yields. So if the developing world were to adapt organic production, they would have a tremendous increase in yield. And you know, I think we need to test these ideas and figure that out. I also think we may not have a choice. You know, it may not be up to us to decide. Industrial agriculture depends on huge amounts of fossil fuel. To produce this kind of processed food, it takes 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 calorie of food energy. You know, this is a system ostensibly based on photosynthesis. There should be a way to get more energy rather than less when you're producing food. And there is under certain systems. So I don't know that, you know, in the same way we're going to have to learn how to drive an industrial economy without a lot of fossil fuel, we're going to have to learn how to create a lot of food without a lot of fossil fuel.
I think one of the really interesting things that's happened when I was talking about the food reform movement, but also that you emphasize, is that food is culture. It's not so much about nutrition. And actually the things that become activated once you begin to use food as a social idea as much as anything, is very powerful. And that food, you know, from your own experience, the food reform movement in America, do you think it has really changed how some communities are able to think about themselves?
Well, I don't want to exaggerate how much has been accomplished yet. I mean, we're really at the beginning. We still have an enormous problem around the food system. There are the stirrings of a movement, and it's very exciting to see what's happening. You have tremendous growth in local food economies, in organic food, even in bad economic times. I remember people predicting when the crash came in 2008, well, that's it for your sustainable food movement. And it hasn't been the case. People are still gravitating toward these alternatives. Yeah, mostly middle class, but the movement is gradually democratizing. There's a tremendous emphasis in America, we were talking about before we went on, around urban agriculture and growing food in underserved areas. There's a problem here. I was reading in the Guardian about, you don't call them food deserts, that's what we call them. Well, you have another name for them. Areas that where even if you want fresh produce, you can't find it because there aren't full-scale supermarkets or farmers markets. And there's a lot of work being done to extend the benefits of this kind of food to people who can't now afford it. There are tremendous issues around affordability, however. Cheap food is a blessing to the poor, arguably. But in fact, I think what's happened as we've reduced the amount of money we have to spend on food and made food cheap. I mean, in America now, we spend 9.5% of our income on food. That's less than any people in history. Here, I think it's 12 or 13 or something like that. In France and Italy, it's 15 or 16. And then you go to the developing world, it's 40, 50%. And that seems like a good thing, but in fact, what's happened is that in America, cheap food has subsidized the decline of wages. So that savings has been captured by employers more than individuals. And also, you know, it is what allows people to buy lots of computers and CDs and all that kind of stuff. So the challenge is to figure out how to make food affordable. Not necessarily cheaper, but more affordable. And that may mean giving people more money to buy higher quality food rather than cheapening everything in sight.